Well, today we have the privilege of talking about the Affordable Housing Crisis Report from the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury. Joining us is 2017-18 Grand Jury member Henry Groth. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I understand that you were the chairperson of the investigative committee that developed this report.
Right. It was a great pleasure being on the committee. We had 7 to 9 members on the committee, and the effort was truly collaborative.
Yeah. So this is obviously a topic of great interest to folks here in Palo Alto and throughout the county. I'm curious, how did this become a subject of the grand jury's interest and investigation?
Well, there have been plenty of reports from media over the last years about the housing crisis and especially about homelessness. And as we looked at the various issues around homelessness, we thought that the below market rate housing approach could be improved greatly throughout the county and throughout the state, and it was a subject ripe for investigation.
And you made it clear, Henry, just now with your answer that this is something that the grand jury initiated as opposed to many other reports which are based on complaints. And can you talk a little about what the process is for the grand jury to proactively pick a subject to interview? I understand there's a 2/3 threshold of some sort. I know there's some misconceptions in the community about that.
Right, GENNADY. I think generally, we do evaluate all the complaints that come in, and if we have a vote of 12 out of the 19 grand jurors to move forward on an investigation based on a complaint, we do start an investigation. A similar 12 out of 19 vote is required to publish a report.
And that's like a legal requirement, right, the 2/3 thing?
That's right. I believe that's a statutory requirement. And for these other reports that we wrote that weren't based on complaints, there are folks in the grand jury that say, here's a subject I think should be investigated, and here's why. And they do a little preliminary investigation. In our grand jury, they presented the results of that preliminary investigation and then asked the grand jurors whether they could start an investigation. If they got 12 out of 19 in the plenary vote, they were able to proceed.
Okay. So was the report started then, or the investigation started immediately after you began, which I believe you said it was June 2017? Was this topic raised immediately?
I think it was raised within a few months, but we really didn't get our inspiration to move forward with it until November or December. Yeah. So that kept us a little bit short on time in getting all the results.
You interviewed a lot of people in order to get this. Can you tell us just the scope of the data that you collected and how you went about putting this information together?
Sure. I think we were inspired by some of the leaders in our county about what they thought solutions could be. There was a consensus that maybe the sacrifice among the cities wasn't shared fairly, and that spurred us on. And we looked at plenty of investigations from other sources and from our city leaders, our county leaders, and proceeded based on the information we were able to acquire.
Great. And I know we're going to get into the substance of the report in a second, but I just want to make sure we're clear on what the process is right now for the various cities. I understand they have until September 20th and then to respond to this report, and it's going to go to a judge for evaluation. What happens during that process? Can they be asked to kind of...
The grand jury has what's called a continuity committee. And that continuity committee will evaluate the responses to see if they're actually responding as they're required by the state. And the requirement is not that severe. They just have to say, we either agree with the finding or we don't agree with the finding, and they can partially agree with the finding, and then they can state whether they're going to actually implement the recommendation, they're not going to implement the recommendation, or they're going to study the recommendation. As long as they have those responses, the cities and other entities that are required to respond have met their obligation. My understanding is the judge just verifies that they've made that threshold response, doesn't get into the substantive details of the response. The continuity committee will probably get into those substantive responses and see if further investigation is required or merited.
So is there a penalty for cities if they didn't respond? I'm unclear on the kind of legals.
I don't think it happens very frequently. I think they probably have a request from the grand jury stating, again, you didn't respond, where is it? I think there probably are fines that can be assessed. I don't think that happens, and I don't know that there are fines that can be assessed. It's just a surmise on my part.
So let's dive into some of the recommendations. There are a raft of them. There are both findings and recommendations. One of the bigger ones that I was really intrigued by was the notion of subregions, that cities would actually work together to meet affordable housing goals as required by the state. Where did this idea come from?
there's a statute that allows various adjoining cities to form subregions. I don't know all the details about the requirements in the statute. I looked at it. It's pretty mind-numbing. But generally, if they're adjacent to each other, they can form the subregion to more effectively address their BMR requirements. And our take was that there's a lot of pressure from the state. There's talk about taking away some local control. And in order to avoid that possibility, we thought it would be good for the cities in our county to join together, address the BMR requirements more effectively, and take that pressure away from the state so they can act with full control of their permitting process.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to make an argument against cities working together, especially with their neighbors. But is there any kind of concern that the sub-region system would kind of allow some of the wealthier cities to pretty much buy their way out of their obligations and force some of the poorer cities to create a lot more housing, which could impact their communities, in ways residents might find somewhat displeasing, basically?
Yeah, I think that's a
shifting problem, basically, with money.
That's a fantastic concern. I think even the cities that have the money and have the higher cost housing worry about that they're going to have their reputation besmirched because they're taking advantage of the lower cost cities. I think what we tried to outline was not only would you provide money for the housing in those lower cost cities, but you'd help fund some of the infrastructure that would need to be generated to support that additional housing, and you would still want to have some of the BMR housing in the higher cost cities.
One of the areas that are actually using subregions right now, as detailed in your report, is San Mateo. What did you learn from San Mateo about how they're trying to unroll this subregions idea?
I think they've been doing it for quite some time. I think it's been at least 3 to 5 years, and the results haven't been fantastic, but we still think it's promising for us to follow their lead and maybe do things a little bit more differently. I think there was one adjoining city pair, I think it might have been Woodside and Redwood City or Atherton and Redwood City, where they were able to get some more housing in Redwood City and join forces in that regard. Otherwise, I believe they were able to do a more efficient element generation. The housing element is part of the general plan, and I think they worked with a consultant called 21 Elements and were able to generate their housing elements with less cost as a consequence of being in the subregion. But I think there's a lot more that can be done, and hopefully if our cities join together, they will be able to show how it can be done.
And I think one of the issues that kind of flared up on Town Square, and I think we discussed it a little bit beforehand, is the kind of the why portion of the report. Before you get into the recommendation, the grand jury report kind of frames the argument as a NIMBY versus YIMBY kind of thing, which I think many people see as a little simplistic, at least from our comments. And I was curious if you can comment a little about the framing of the debate and kind of how you guys went about explaining to people how the political conversation is unfolding. And I think the counter argument is it's perfectly reasonable to argue about transportation impacts from new developments or school impacts without necessarily being a NIMBY.
I agree completely. I think just because you're arguing against development doesn't make you a YIMBY. If you're unwilling to look at reasonable alternatives and you think, well, as long as they do it in a different city or different location than my city, then that might be somewhat objectionable. But if you have legitimate transportation concerns, and anybody living in this valley has legitimate transportation concerns, those need to be addressed with any additional housing. That's why we're talking about density near transportation hubs.
Yeah, and I feel like the recommendations are pretty clear that this is where the growth you'd want to see focused on, which I think very few people would object to. I think the part that they would object to is the idea that there needs to be some kind of a communication campaign led by the county to, I think the word was convert NIMBYs into YIMBYs. I don't think people really want to be converted. It's got this propagandistic shades, just that one sentence.
I follow the objection. I think it's a reasonable objection. I think the idea was we want people to be more enthusiastic and be more open to below market rate housing and denser developments. Don't want to be overly critical of folks who resist it, just want them to be open-minded. I think a communication campaign could help them become more open-minded.
There are quite a few recommendations, and the majority of them Palo Alto needed to take some steps on, but there were a couple that Palo Alto's made some strides in the recent year, I believe it is.
Yeah, like the commercial linkage fees. They were going to go to like 60, but then actually if some of the housing advocates thought that 60 would be too high because it might discourage development at all, so I think they scaled it back to 35. But that's like a rare glimmer of good news from Palo Alto based on the grand jury findings. I think in most cases, they're pretty far back in terms of their RENA obligations, and especially BMR category.
Yeah, one thing I was kind of just wondering about is just how expensive, I guess it would be, is it for the cities to address some of these recommendations? Did the grand jury consider that kind of aspect of the staffing costs, I guess it were, that it would take for the cities to meet some of these recommendations, to adopt linkage fees,
I don't think we looked at staffing costs, but what we tried to do is provide a multiple array of avenues to generate more funding for BMR and leave it up to the cities to work out which ones would be appropriate for them. We didn't expect all of our recommendations to be accepted by the cities, but if they looked at them and said, out of the 5 recommendations, this is the one that works best for us given our constraints and our particular situation, we thought helping that conversation get started so the planning staff could work with the city councils and say, here's what our recommendation is. That's what we were hoping for.
And I do think one of the great services of this report is it actually helps with the staff work because it shows how each city stack up with each other. It does a lot of the kind of benchmarking. Benchmarking from various cities. So I was curious, Henry, did you find that these kinds of arguments and the way this debate is played out is pretty uniform throughout the county, or are there sections of the county that kind of are maybe more likely to embrace these recommendations than others? Because we often hear about, the county line being something that's bureaucratic on the map, but people don't really see them.
We found each city had its own unique characteristics. We found some cities that seemed to be resistant to taking an activist role. Saratoga stood out as one that said, basically, we're going to set the table. If nobody comes to the table, that's good enough. Whereas I think most other cities are more activist. Montecito was another one that wasn't particularly active. But if you look at the conditions in those cities, what would they be able to accomplish even if they were very activist? That's why the report has a section about San Jose. San Jose dominates the county, and unless San Jose generates enough below market rate housing, the county itself isn't going to meet the RENA objectives.
Yeah, and you do have a special section of San Jose making that point. And how do you think San Jose is doing right now, given their outsized importance that you just mentioned in the county, as far as addressing this humongous issue?
I think they're doing quite well in many instances. I think downtown is progressing beautifully. They've got great transportation opportunities there. They've got transportation developments that they've been working on, these villages, for years and years and years. They seem to be a little bit slow on the rollout, but the pace seems to be picking up. And I think that's where the opportunity is. I think they've missed some chances in the past where they looked at downtown and said, we don't want to stop development, we don't want to hinder development, so we're going to ease up on the BMR requirements, we're going to ease up on the in lieu fees. And maybe that was the right decision because downtown needed to keep on growing. But we would like to see them try to give up something else instead of the BMR funding if they need to encourage developers because it's so desperately needed.
Yeah, and there's another argument we've been hearing that housing is just one half of the equation, the other one's commercial development, and that no matter how much you do, you could meet all these recommendations, build more housing, but if Facebook, Google, Apple continue to kind of expand like crazy, it's just going to exacerbate the demand even more, so you're just kind of spinning your wheels. And I mean, some people wonder why the grand jury didn't take that up concurrently, the pace of commercial development to complement this, and I'm curious if you have any comments on that.
I think it's a great point. I think that we have a limited amount of time on the grand jury, and we don't want to be naysayers about commercial development. I think capitalism is all about growth. We don't want to discourage that, but it has to be reasonable and sustainable. So I think it's an excellent point, and perhaps the next grand jury can explore that.
Okay. Next grand jury, hope you're listening.
Now, Henry, I know that you're constrained in what you can talk about as a juror, and I'm wondering, can we take that hat off and speak with you just as a citizen of this county about your experience?
That would be great. I could be a little bit more frank.
Okay, yeah. I'm, for starters, curious what your experience was with this topic before the investigation and what your reaction has been as you've learned with the state of things.
Well, I would say 6 or 7 years ago, I might have been almost in the NIMBY category. I wasn't really very optimistic about density. Didn't really understand the arguments. So I think as time has gone on before the grand jury and during the grand jury, I begin to appreciate those arguments more. Okay. And I think as somebody on the grand jury studied this topic in great depth, I've appreciated a lot of the stakeholders. There's various nonprofit organizations like Silicon Valley at Home that I think are contributing a lot to solving problems. And I think, like I said to you earlier, I think each city planning department impressed us. They're doing a great job, and they have their constraints, and we're trying to give them options to generate more revenue so they have fewer constraints.
Have some of the concerns that you shared before as someone who kind of leaned towards the NIMBY side, have those concerns fallen away? Are you less convinced that the quality of life is going to fall apart, with greater density, or what was it that kind of evolved in your thinking?
I think my understanding of how badly the exurb model works, where we're developing new housing in Tracy and people are commuting 2 hours, that adds so much more to our transportation woes than having people along Caltrain and hopping on the train. I think the other issue that's come up in my discussions with other folks as a citizen is the problem of the spurs going east-west from Caltrain. How do we solve that problem? There was one comment that I saw from your article, GENNADY, that I thought was pretty interesting about having bus services from the exit ramps of 280. There are all sorts of great thinkers here among your commenters and among other folks. I think we need to solve that spur problem as well if we're going to get our transportation working.
Did anything seriously surprise you over the course of the investigation, or anything that you could talk about that surprised you, if there was anything? Because you guys have done a lot of research. I think your report mentions like 65 different people being interviewed, things like that.
I guess a little bit of the surprise was, at first we were focusing on cities that didn't seem to be even getting close to their arena numbers and saying, well, we really need to push those folks.
Palo Alto.
And then the realization that no matter what they do, if San Jose doesn't get their share up, it's not going to matter. So I think that was the biggest aha moment that I had.
As an individual, do you find your interests then continuing after this report in different ways? Are you going to look, for example, to follow what's happening in San Jose and maybe get involved there, or this transportation spur idea? Where are you at after having gone through?
I'm catching my breath because the grand jury was a big effort, and all of those are possibilities for where I go forward. I'd like to get involved in my own city, which is the city of Santa Clara. Maybe take a role in their planning commission, help them. But there's no clear path ahead of me right now.
Yeah. One thing I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with, but what is the civil grand jury? And why do people get involved in it?
I think they get involved because they want to be activist citizens, and this is an opportunity for them to be the voice for the community, the citizen voice for the community, not looking for an election, just trying to contribute and solve problems. And they're interested in government efficiency. I think a lot of the grand jury work is to identify where the government could improve. Sometimes we find fraud, sometimes we find other more nefarious activities. Nothing like that in this investigation. People are doing their jobs, they're doing them well. Maybe we could offer some suggestions for them to do it better.
How much work were you putting into it?
Some weeks it was 45 hours. Most weeks between January and June it was between 20 and 35 hours. Oh my gosh, yeah. And we had some guys that were working 50 hours. They were really great contributors.
Yeah. Are people on the civil grand jury for more than 1 year? Or is this just a 1 year?
That's an excellent question. In Santa Clara, there used to be a general pattern of 3 holdovers. This year, I think they had more on the order of 8 or 9.
Wow.
And that continuity is helpful because when you start in a 1 year cycle, you're really just learning for the first 4 or 5 months. If you have those holdovers, they can be much more efficient. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the next grand jury comes up with.
Yeah, I'm curious. Obviously, there's a lot of gloom in the report for cities like Saratoga and Palo Alto. If you're a resident who's concerned about the housing obligations and providing, but there's also been some kind of positive movement for people who think housing crisis needs to be addressed, like the passage of a bond. I think in countywide Measure A. I'm curious. Are you optimistic that the challenges you identify in the report are being met and that it's kind of going in the right direction, or are the political challenges you identify so entrenched that you think it's going to be a slow going to get out of this?
I think it's going to take a lot of effort from a lot of people to overcome these challenges and meet these challenges. I think our county is full of citizens that want to do the right thing. So I think we have great potential in this county. We have innovation throughout the county. So I think if anybody can do it, we can.
Do you think this will require kind of more direct kind of reach from the state or arena or any regional agencies, or do you think the grassroots model could work here in shifting things? Or is this a grand jury recommendation question?
No, I think that's a great question, and that's the tension that we tried to address in the report to some extent, that in forming a sub-region, you might be able to finesse that tension between the state and the cities. I don't think the cities themselves can solve it without joining in a sub-region, and I think if they don't address it more effectively, there is a chance the state's going to start taking away some of their zoning powers. I'd rather not see that. I think what is really important to local communities is to be able to define their own communities.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Henry, I want to thank you for your service on the civil grand jury, and thanks for coming in to share your insights about this report and about affordable housing and where the county needs to go.
I wanted to thank GENNADY and yourself for the excellent reporting you've given us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. That wraps it up for this week's Behind the Headlines. If you'd like to follow Palo Alto news and more on housing, go to paloaltoonline.com. And to discuss this report, go to Town Square, paloaltoonline.com/square. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you want to see more webcasts, you can subscribe below. That wraps it up. We'll see you next week.